This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to This Week in the Boardroom. I'm Scott Cutler, Executive Vice President with NYSE Euronext, and today I'm joined by my guest, Michele Edkins, Managing Director and Head of Global Corporate Governance and Responsible Investments at BlackRock, and she's also the Chairman of the Board of Governors of the International Corporate Governance Network. The title of our program today is the International Corporate Governance Network Meets in the United States. And Michele, this must be an incredibly busy time for you, being that we're in the middle of proxy and annual report season, coupled with being the chairman of the ICGN. And you've got an annual conference coming up here at the end of June in New York. And thank you very much for taking time out of your hectic schedule to join us today. Most of our familiars are, of course, familiar with BlackRock and your role at BlackRock. So let's start about talking about the ICGN. Maybe you can share with us first some information about the organization and a little bit of an overview of the annual meeting, which takes place at the end of the month.
Thank you, I'd be delighted to. So the ICGN was founded nearly 20 years ago, in fact at a meeting in the US. And its purpose is to bring together corporate governance practitioners to share practices from around the world. It is predominantly an investor-led organization, but obviously if you only have investors, it's a one-sided conversation. So we're very keen to include companies both from the executive side and from the director side to ensure that the debate that we have about where corporate governance should go is quite balanced. So there are about 600 individual members, and they are based in around 50 countries internationally, and using the sort of a representative figure of the investor side representing about $18 trillion. In terms of its purpose or its mission, the ICGN focuses on influencing the corporate governance policy framework to ensure that it supports robust governance practices, both on the part of the issuers and on the part of the investors. And the other key part of it is connecting members, and that's the network part, obviously, right. Because there's a lot of experience in the practitioner community, and the more that we can share that across borders and move things forward, the better it will be for investors and for companies, I think. So the annual conference helps us meet the third of our purpose or mission objectives, which is informing members. And we bring together in this year's conference a really top-notch lineup of speakers, predominantly from the US, because that's one of the things that we try and achieve is a local flavor wherever we have the conference. And you know, the point of the debate and the subject of the meeting being challenging the accepted orthodoxy, and that theme comes from this view that a lot has changed in corporate governance in the US. A lot of market practices internationally are led out of the US. So maybe it's time to take a look and see whether what we're doing makes sense given the sort of global environment and the trend towards change.
Well, it's interesting you're seeing corporate governance take some of the headlines in the newspapers, and so even traditional media, mainstream media is catching on to this. And we've talked a lot about the role and responsibility that boards have to communicate with shareholders. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the specific goals of the ICGN, and then what are the challenges in meeting those goals?
Sure. Well, I think it's interesting you say that there's been a lot of focus on the boards of directors, because that is predominantly what the debate in corporate governance has been for the last decade or more. And I think the spotlight is shifting now to the role of the investor. And what does it mean to be a responsible investor, an engaged investor? And I think, in the context of the long-term investing debate, are investors part of the problem or part of the solution? And one of the things that ICGN is definitely trying to prove is that investors are part of the solution. So we have renewed this year, and we'll be putting it to members for approval at the annual meeting, our principles or our guidelines on the roles and responsibilities of institutional investors. Because if we don't have a sort of clear-cut framework for that, I think we can end up operating at cross purposes, basically. And I think it's really helpful guidance for companies and for boards of directors to see what they can expect of their investors in that way.
Well, obviously, your organization is international. It's in the title. But a lot of the corporate governance principles that we talk about tend to be focused in the United States. And the governance model in the United States is more focused on long-term shareholder and the disclosures around that. But you've got other models that are looking at broader concerns, such as stakeholders, as an example. But how would you categorize the United States in terms of its progress in corporate governance? And then how would you compare that progress to maybe what's happening best of class in other countries?
Sure. I think although practice in each market is different, and generally that's informed by corporate history, corporate law, cultural differences, we believe that there are some global practices and global standards that apply whether you're a company listed in Asia or a company listed in North America. And generally those principles center around the accountability of the board to the shareholders, and the right that shareholders have to sufficient information to take informed decisions. And part of that decision is around voting, but it's also obviously around buying or selling. And so when you compare across markets, it's always difficult to say this one is good and this one is bad, because some things are effective in one place that wouldn't be as effective in another place. And I think a prime example of that is the idea to introduce independent directors into Japanese corporate boards, because your average Japanese director doesn't actually know what an independent director's responsibilities are. They're not really defined. It isn't something that's evolved over time. It's a practice that was considered because it's done elsewhere. Now, it's not to say that it wouldn't be a good idea to have independent directors in Japanese corporate boards, but people have to know what's expected of them and what they have to do in those roles for it to be effective. And if they don't, then you have this moral hazard, if you like, of people from the outside thinking there's an independent component in the boardroom, when in fact that person doesn't have a defined role, so there's nothing happening.
Right.
And so I think we have to be really careful what we wish for in some of these situations. Arguably, transparency around executive compensation is another area where we might have gone a little too far, because arguably transparency enables the sort of benchmarking and the leapfrogging that we are experiencing in a lot of Western markets now, and that we're getting in fact regulation on to push back on, because it's gone too far perhaps.
How do investors, particularly global investors like a BlackRock, look at voting and their responsibility when you have different corporate governance models in different countries? How do you actually do that?
In practice, it comes back to this point about there being overarching global principles, but that in local markets, you have to also look at what is accepted practice. And so one example is obviously in the US, the predominance of combined chairman-chief executive. In other markets, that's much less common, but equally, boards here know how to operate in that context, as boards elsewhere know how to operate in a context where you have the separate roles, and the role of the chairman being to manage the board and run the board, and the role of the CEO to run the company. But any change that is quite dramatic and across a market will take time, and there'll be a transition period. So when it comes to voting, I can only speak from my own experience, but we do try to take a local approach in those markets, as long as the high-level principles are being observed about protecting the rights of minority shareholders, which is what we are.
Well, since we're right in the thick of the season, what are the most interesting topics that you're addressing right now with BlackRock in this season?
Well, I think it not just BlackRock, but you see it in the newspapers. Perhaps the most sort of perennial issue, as ever, is executive pay. And that's something we're seeing in the US being under the spotlight, as well as in Europe. And I think companies are doing a much better job now at making that the case for the link between company performance and the pay under these incentive plans and so on. But I think it's always going to be a topical issue because, firstly, it's a very clear window into the operation of the board. And does it look like the board is acting in the interests of shareholders, or has it been captured by management? And arguably pay is not the most important issue of governance. In fact, I would argue that very strongly. But it is a sort of touch point where it's a very clear indicator of the board's ability to balance the power of management. And continuing from that point, the most important thing from our perspective, and I think from most investors' perspective, is who is on the board and are they doing a good job?
Well, since we have a lot of public directors that are tuning in today, what's your best advice to the public director in terms of how to engage, or the best way to engage with shareholders?
I would say the most important thing is to be willing to do it. And you're definitely seeing an increase in that in the US. Engagement between board members and shareholders is much more prevalent in Europe. And I think directors here have for a long time been nervous of it for a range of different reasons, but I think comfort levels are rising. And there are a couple of things I think are important. One being willing to do it, particularly when there isn't a crisis. It's sometimes a little bit too late to wait until there is a crisis, then you want to meet your shareholders for the first time. And I would say the other thing about it is often it's about listening. So directors should be much less concerned about accidentally conveying private information or anything like that. A lot of the time, the importance of this meeting is to hear what your shareholders think, what their policies are, how they apply them, so the board understands that for itself, as opposed to getting that advice secondhand, either from management or from board advisors.
Well, you have the ICGN annual event coming up. How do board members or senior officers attend, and where can people go to find more information?
Well, everybody's welcome as long as they're willing to pay. And we would really welcome having more corporate representatives, both again at the staff level and at the board level. And more information can be found on the ICGN website, which is www.icgn.org. And there's a whole section there on the conference and the registration process and the agenda, which is a very good agenda, I have to say.
Well, thank you very much for your thoughts and insights. This topic of international corporate governance standards is, I think, something that we're going to be talking about for a long time. And certainly the model that we maintain here in the U.S. is not static by any means. So thank you for your observations.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in this week. And hopefully you can watch next time as we attack another important topic to make you a more effective board or committee member. Thank you very much.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.